Well, good morning, everyone. I'm happy to be here, and I love sitting across from two members of Congress. Of all the things I could ask them today, I think science and innovation is right near the top. And let's start talking about innovation. It is, after all, the name of this conference. I'm sure Microsoft founder and billionaire Bill Gates has gotten a lot of attention at this conference so far. He has been making the rounds in Washington to talk about the importance of energy and development and innovation. As part of the Paris climate talks, he and many others launched the Breakthrough Energy Coalition, which is aimed at finding and developing technologies that can help solve the world's climate change problem. The Obama administration also similarly committed to doubling its research and development budget over the next 5 years, along with more than a dozen other countries. Mr. Gates has said that the energy breakthrough that will save our planet is 15 years away. So I want to know, do you guys agree, yes or no?
Well,
and I politely ask for a yes or no.
Well, one assumption implicit in that is that there is the energy breakthrough. In reality, it's likely to be a handful of very important individual breakthroughs. I think I just spent the last hour wandering around the floor with all of the ARPA-E projects in various stages of development. And any one of those could be transformative to one sector of the energy economy. And so I would not be surprised in the end if it's actually a mixture of several breakthroughs. And the timescale is another interesting question because Bill Gates' initiative is now trying to do long-term investment, which has a number of challenges that the government has been facing for a long time. You know, the government's role historically has been to invest in things with too long a time scale to really be of commercial interest. And so you face the fact that any intellectual property that you develop today, you know, if it's a 20 or 30-year project before there's a commercial product there, any IP today is off the patent window.
Senator Coons, what about you? Do you agree 15 years there'll be an energy breakthrough solving climate change?
Yes.
See, this is why I like to talk to Senator Coons, because.
And just if I could, to expand on that a little bit, my view here is that Bill Gates' entry into this field is potentially a game changer because he is assembling an internationally prominent group of high net worth individuals who've been successful, many of them in business, and who have the capability to create a pull effect. And if we do our part and double America's investment in federally funded R&D, we can create the push at the base level of basic science. We do have a bipartisan energy bill that I am optimistic will move through the Senate. Brian Schott, senator from Hawaii, moved an amendment to it that actually garnered some Republican support that would put us on a path towards steadily increasing our federal R&D investment. As the congressman and I well know, in the divided and partisan environment of the current Congress, committing to doubling federal R&D investment is very difficult. But if you look at the challenges facing our country and the world, whether it's in health and healthcare, whether it's in energy, whether it's in climate change, all of them can be made better or addressed through basic R&D that is then applied. None of them can be solved without it.
So let's talk a little bit about the government's research and development budget. It's currently about $6.5 billion, which including the national labs, which I know is an important issue to both of you. But $6.5 billion is approximately 0.58% of the overall government budget. Energy R&D has traditionally been one of those energy areas, rare energy areas, that get some bipartisan rhetorical support, at least. So how much do you think Congress actually, or the government, the US government, should be spending on R&D? I mean, the number is 6.5 billion. Should it be 100 billion? Should it be 50 billion? And then what do you think Congress could actually do? Congressman Foster?
I think that depends on the time scale that you're optimizing. If you say your goal is to optimize GDP some number of years out, then clearly energy research is one of the highest payoff activities in the long and medium term. But in the short term, the payoff of R&D is very small. And so then what you're facing is the conflict, the misalignment of incentives between the short-term political incentives and the long-term best interests of our country, which is something that we struggle with all the time.
And that's the challenges inherent in addressing climate change
Yeah, you
as well.
could be a hero this election if you balance the budget by cutting research and development, and then when the economy underperforms in the coming decades, you just blame it on the other party. So,
Senator Coons, what do you think about, by what magnitude should the R&D budget be increased in Congress? Do you think doubling over 5 years is enough?
If we were to double it, we would still be below R&D as a percentage of GDP that we were investing at the height of our leadership role globally in investing in basic and applied science. We continue to be a competitive economy globally, really only because we are living off the seed corn of some of the world's leading global universities and their research infrastructure and our national labs. ARPA-E has played an absolutely essential role in the translation, in making some investments in critical and game-changing technologies. And I'm thrilled that all of you are here again for this important annual conference. But we have to continue to accelerate not just the amount of money we are investing federally in R&D, but in its relevance, its productivity, and its outcomes. I was encouraged by the independent report on the national labs last year. There's been a number of pieces of legislation, one that I've championed, that will strengthen the ability of the labs to spin out IP and to translate them into the marketplace. I think we ought to be looking not just at the dollar amount we're investing, but at what difference it's making on a 10 or 20 or 50-year time horizon. Doubling our investment in R&D will pay enormous dividends for the people of the United States, for our economy, and for the world.
So Congressman Foster, as you all know, he is the only physicist, only PhD physicist in Congress. So I'm going to put you on the spot here and quiz you on some physics. So do you take the concept of climate geoengineering seriously? This concept, where I'm sure many of you know, is where that Earth's, that scientists would somehow alter the Earth's climatic systems to somehow reverse climate change. Do you think that's something, do you take that seriously? And do you think we're getting to a point where we might have to take that seriously consider?
I'm worried that we might. I think it is something
you said we might?
Yeah, I'm worried that you might. If your choice eventually is losing the Greenland ice sheet or putting some sulfur dioxide particulates in a way that volcanoes have been doing for eons, you may encounter a point where the world decides that's a lower risk path forward. It would be a tragedy if we had to go there, but frankly, given the difficulties in getting the political systems of all the countries in the world to do something that's against their short-term economic interests, I think it's something we should just a card we should keep in our back pocket and hope we never have to play.
Senator Coons, I see you sort of nodding your head. Do you agree, as the non-physicist? But
I agree as a chemist, but not a PhD chemist.
I have neither, so.
As someone who is unfortunately now doing politics for a living, I'll agree that after the truly inspiring progress of the Paris Climate Summit, there's been some disheartening developments, the Clean Power Plan being stayed by the courts, some real challenges in getting a bipartisan energy bill through both houses. There's, I think, a veto threat against the House version. It's clear that we're not making the progress as quickly as we need to in the United States. We don't have both political parties aligned behind combating climate change, and so we may have to have other strategies as we begin to see dramatic changes in our climate and its impact on people, on the environment, on animal species. The consequences of climate change, I think, are becoming clearer and clearer. It's just the political class in Washington that seems to be continuing to stick their head in the sand and avoid it. And so we may need a plan B.
Of course, it raises the question, if Congress doesn't get on board with any sort of climate bill, would they be in support of climate and geoengineering? That, I can imagine some interesting congressional hearings on that subject. But in fact, Congress has been surprisingly productive lately, despite the recent stalemate over this broad but not exactly sweeping policy energy bill that's pending in the Senate right now. You likely remember that one of those rare grand bargains happened late last year, where both sides of the aisle came together and got something that they wanted. The Republicans and the oil industry got a lifting of the 40-year-old export ban on oil, and in exchange, a 5-year extension of the renewable solar and wind tax credits, which of course the administration has been emphasizing is essential to help get these sources to a point where they can compete on their own and also help states ultimately comply with the Clean Power Plan should it withstand
And
legal
very
scrutiny.
importantly, also included in that bargain was essentially acceding to the president's mark for all the science budgets, which was a real, a very important triumph, at least on our side of the aisle.
Right, so that was a rare glimpse of bipartisanship in Congress. Why did that deal work when so many others in the past haven't? And currently, right now, this energy bill seems to be stuck in the Senate. It had a veto threat in the House. What was the magic then that could somehow be repeated today?
I think it's very simple. Something that fossil fuel interests really, really, really wanted badly. And those in the Republican Party were willing to trade virtually everything else, their policy riders, their position on climate change, their position on renewables. They were willing to change all of that in order to get access to the export markets. The dramatic drop in the per barrel price of oil has really negatively impacted significantly many American states that are significant oil and gas producers and potential exporters, and that created a lot of pressure on Republicans in the Senate to open up export markets, and that created a lot of pressure to reach some compromise. Let me, if I could, just briefly mention two other aspects of this $1.7 trillion tax and spending package that I think are worthy of some brief note. One is that a piece of it was making the R&D tax credit permanent. It has been an unreliable on-again, off-again tax credit for decades. And it's a key potential advantage to our competitiveness for companies to now be able to plan on the R&D credit. But there's also a small provision that I co-authored with Senator Roberts that makes the R&D credit accessible to early stage and startup companies, which was not previously the case. Pre-profitability, small startup tech companies couldn't access the R&D tax credit. Now they can. That was part of that end of the year bargain that I think is another small but important win, particularly for those in innovation and in science fields.
So on the House side, what made it possible?
Yeah, one of the tragedies of politics as it relates to this is that there's sort of two aspects of this. Fossil fuels, for whatever reason, tends to be a red state thing, whereas innovation tends to be a blue state thing. There's a very interesting scatter plot, I think, at a website called Politics That Work, that shows the number of patents issued per capita as a function of the voting proclivities in presidential elections. And there's a very strong correlation. And so, that was really part of the deal when you had to have a red state and blue state deal being struck. We got fossil fuels for innovation.
Senator Coons, you have prided yourself on doing a lot of bipartisan work, and more so than a lot of lawmakers in Congress. Say for you, Congressman Foster, you actually have a lot of evidence of that. In 2011, you sponsored an innovation and jobs bill with Senator Marco Rubio. Some of you may know him as a presidential candidate. I won't ask you about your opinion on him as a candidate right now, but what areas do you see for bipartisanship the rest of this year, but also perhaps even more importantly next year? Do you see tax policy, for example, as an area, we hear a lot of talk about comprehensive tax reform, which could have significant impact on the science and innovation sector. Do you actually see that happening next year?
Sure. Let me cite another example, if I might, and I will answer your question. Senator Rubio is a very agile, very capable senator and candidate, and I will be interested to see how he fares in the primaries.
Is he your favorite Republican candidate?
Sure. I will say this, he was great to work with on a number of different bills. The Innovates bill was one that is trying to implement a whole series of proposals made in a joint study by the Heritage Foundation, Bipartisan Policy Center, and ITIF, that came together with a menu of proposed changes to the labs. You asked about tax policy. I've got a bipartisan bill that I've been working on for 2 Congresses now, the Master Limited Partnership Parity Act, and it came very close to being included in that end of the year deal. It would be the first permanent tax advantage for renewables. And it has strong bipartisan support. Congressman Ted Poe of Texas, not known as a fan of renewables, from Houston is the lead, along with Mike Thompson in the House. And Senator Murkowski, who's chair of the Energy Committee, along with Senator Moran of Kansas and Senator Gardner of Colorado, are co-sponsors, along with me and several other senators in the Senate. I just met with the chairman of the Ways and Means Committee in the House about it. Senator Wyden and Senator Hatch are well familiar with it. It would provide a tax advantage capital formation vehicle for renewables, for energy efficiency, carbon sequestration, and all renewables. And it scores relatively low. It would be the next step after the advantages that were gotten for wind and solar and the end of the year deal. And I think it is bipartisan. It would allow permanency for the MLP vehicle that fossil fuels want, because it is a vehicle that the administration has tried to eliminate year after year. And it would broaden MLPs and make them truly an all of the above energy strategy from a tax perspective. So I'll lift that up as one small but important piece of tax policy that I think would be positive for the energy space.
Do you think that could get done this year or next year?
If there is an end of the year extenders bill that is open to anything other than date extenders, I think it could get done. My hunch is that given the likely dynamics of the presidential campaign, we may not get anything like that done until next year. We'll see.
So on this energy bill that's pending before the Senate right now, a similar version passed the House, which got a veto threat from the White House, but the Senate bill has not. Just very quickly, what would you say are the percentage odds that you think this bill will be signed into law? 50%, 75%?
Well, I'd have to see the details of this. I mean, it just, from my point of view, that I voted against the House bill because it had a number of very objectionable environmental provisions. And to the extent those are stripped out in the Senate, I think that really increases the chances of getting at least some Democratic support for this.
What about you, Senator?
Senator Murkowski of Alaska and Senator Cantwell of Washington have worked very hard to craft an enactable bipartisan energy bill in the Senate. It contains some of the key provisions of the Shaheen-Portman energy efficiency bill. It has a number of provisions from both Energy Competes and from the Innovates bill that I referenced earlier. It's got some modernization to the weatherization program. It has I think a fairly broad menu of reasonable bipartisan provisions and does not face a veto threat. It came out of Energy and Natural Resources Committee by a strong bipartisan vote. If we can get a deal on addressing Flint's water crisis, that's what's been holding it up for the last week, and I believe that's been reached. You should see this bill on the floor of the Senate within the next week. There will be about 30 voice voted amendments, about 7 roll call. The question then is whether the House will take it up and whether it's got a prospect of enactment in the House without having some of the very objectionable provisions that the congressman, I think, understandably voted against, reinserted.
Well, since neither of you will give a percentage, I give it a 49% chance of becoming law, for whatever that is worth. You already mentioned briefly, and we, of course, just heard from the EPA administrator about the Clean Power Plan. So I want to briefly ask you about that and its impact on clean energy investment. So, of course, the Supreme Court blocked, during litigation, the Clean Power Plan. And while the administrator is awfully confident, my legal colleagues tell me that, that's a sign that there are significant legal questions with the regulation. So do you think, number one, that this block will hurt investment in science and innovation and clean energy in the short term? And then ultimately, if it's blocked permanently, what kind of impact do you think that could have on this sector? Congressman Foster?
Well, in terms of the legalism, I will defer to the lawyer on stage here. There's no question that that sort of uncertainty, even if it ultimately falls away, uncertainty is bad for investment, and it's just that simple.
Yeah, the Regional Greenhouse Gas Initiative in New England has demonstrated over a long time now how a regional plan that addresses some of the challenges of emissions and climate change can be a real positive for innovation, for investment, for the economy. The Clean Power Plan, I think, deserves to be fully implemented. The Supreme Court issued a stay, I think it was February 9th, by a narrow 5-4 margin, and Justice Scalia passed away less than a week later. It has been, I think, noticed for a hearing in the DC Circuit. The stay that was issued by the Supreme Court isn't a substantive ruling. It just signals that there's enough concern or question about it that they may hear argument. The substance would have to come up from the DC Circuit. The challenge here, of course, is that that'll lead to at least a year of uncertainty. If one were to make just a rough guess back of the envelope, given the configuration of the court and its view of executive authority, it might now be an evenly divided court if they were to take it up. I don't see any clear path at the moment towards the confirmation of a nominee in the next couple of months. It could be later this year. It could be in the first year of the next administration. Obviously, I think that the president can and should carry out his constitutional duty and nominate an eminently qualified and confirmable candidate for the Supreme Court, and then the Senate should give that nominee hearings. But so far, that doesn't seem to be the position of the majority leader. The majority leader, Senator McConnell of Kentucky, has campaigned aggressively against the Clean Power Plan. He has weighed in with governors and urged them not to file complying plans. He has made it a real point of priority for him and for his caucus. And I do think that will suppress investment in the sector, the lack of certainty. But I do think, to go back to where we began, that seeing major multinational companies making significant commitments in sustainability, seeing major corporate leaders say, not just on the American stage, but on the world stage, that they see climate change as a real threat, and having the leaders of our military branches included in their security plans for the long term is beginning to shift the conversation to one where the ardent climate deniers no longer seem in touch with reality.
Almost everybody who's not in the political world admits and acknowledges and thinks that actually a carbon tax makes a lot more sense for a whole host of reasons. And in fact, there's an increasing number of both right and left-leaning organizations here in Washington trying to build support for a carbon tax. Now, there's no Republican on stage, of course, so I would be remiss if I didn't say that I'm pretty confident that almost every Republican, if not every single Republican in Congress right now, would publicly oppose a carbon tax. But that said, do either of you see any sort of opening for a carbon tax discussion next year? And is that something you guys could support?
You'd have to find a word different than tax to describe it as a starting point.
That's the word, right. That's the favorite.
And I believe, this is all driven by the Grover Norquist pledge signed by essentially all Republican members of Congress and I assume the Senate. And so this is something where it is a net view, so that if this was part of a package that was at least a wash for net revenue, then in principle that does not violate the pledge that all the Republicans have signed. And so that, I think that's the only window for that. I mean, the difficulty with tax reform, there was a very thoughtful tax reform proposal put forward by Chairman Camp in the last session of Congress that was just completely dismissed by leadership. The difficulty, of course, is that there are a very large number of special provisions put into the existing tax code, many by powerful lobbies who will go on high alert the moment that tax simplification is even discussed. And these, this problem will remain. The advantage of a carbon tax, it's very simple. You just put, a scale on the coal mine mouth and a meter on the petroleum refinery. And so it's a low cost to collect. It's got a lot of advantages economically, but it would be substituted for a bunch of other complicated provisions that have strong backers. So.
So this is going to be my final question, and I politely ask you to keep it to as few sentences as possible, although I realize that's always hard here in Washington. What would you say is the single biggest hurdle in addressing the nation's and the world's shift to cleaner sources of energy? Is it a lack of money, lack of political will, the challenge of changing infrastructure, technology?
The political power of the incumbent industries.
And Senator Coons?
I'd agree that the lack of vision on the part of some key political leaders and core industries that see themselves not as energy companies, but as oil or gas or coal companies, and some representatives who represent fiercely, but somewhat narrowly, the interests of their constituents, has certainly made it difficult here. I do think that we are on the verge of significant breakthroughs in a variety of areas, from grid-scale storage and dramatically more efficient batteries to smart grid and distributed generation. There's dozens of promising technologies being showcased and profiled here. And I do think that the innovation capability of the American people and of the world's scientists is not outstripped by the scale of this challenge. I do think we will ultimately come up with solutions to our energy and climate challenges. But it is the greatest difficulty facing the people of the world today, and it requires more and more leadership and more rowing in the same direction. I'm very encouraged by what Bill Gates is doing. I'm very encouraged by President Obama's record on this, and I think it frankly makes the elections of this fall more important than ever.
What do you think, since we have a lot of technologists in the audience, what's the most important technology? The physicists
I put
can answer
batteries
first.
very high on that, or batteries or energy storage, both grid scale and transportation scale. There's a very interesting initiative at Argonne Lab, which is a 5-year program to get a factor of 5 in the energy density of batteries at the same cost. They're roughly at the midpoint and still optimistic. Even if they achieve a square root of 5 at the same cost, it will be transformative. And so if I could have one thing to wish for, that would be it. The production of energy through renewable things like wind has shown a very impressive cost curve, but you have to get around the intermittency problem.
Senator Coons, just very quick, what's your one technology that you think is...
I would agree that significantly increasing storage, if deployed appropriately, would allow the merging of the energy systems that move transportation and that provide base load for houses, for commercial space, for manufacturing, which currently are almost completely separate. And it would allow for more renewables, which are intermittent, to then be a more usable part of base load generation as well as transportation. So a significant increase in the cost effectiveness, efficiency, energy density of batteries and grid scale storage could really move things along.
Or nuclear fusion.
Or that, says the physicist. Well, I want to thank you both for being with us today. Next time we'll get the dirty details on the Republican primary and your thoughts about that. But we are out of time, so I want to say thank you very much for your time today.